Hugo Zilberberg. So we begin today's forum with the first framing conversation. In effect, we're focusing primarily on the economic consequences of both globalization and fragmentation. And we know that interconnection has become ubiquitous, creating vast opportunities for innovation, inclusion, for citizens, corporations, and at the intergovernmental level. And many analyses are now trying to measure and scale the rise of the digital economy and interconnection. And many reports, be it by the World Bank or McKinsey or academics, stress that the pace and ubiquity of change and the opportunities that are emerging have not yet reached their potential and offer tremendous possibilities for the developing world and huge transformational changes in sector after sector, whether it be banking the unbanked or including new voices in decision-making or opportunities for innovation and global sales for small and medium-sized businesses, and change in healthcare, finance, construction, architecture, design, automotive, and more. Blending of the industrial and the digital, the commercial and the digital, this is all very much changing our world. But this is also creating risks and pressures within countries to create new barriers and more fragmented networks. And while these trends are not new, what is, I think, new and different is that technology and globalization are two powerful forces that have combined in the US and elsewhere to create something of a political backlash, be it taking the form of keeping jobs at home or keeping data at home, and other reactions I think that we need to think about, talk about, ponder. So to help us in this first framing conversation, I'm really delighted to have three extraordinary experts, starting with Noam, our professor of economics and finance at Columbia Business School and the Garrett Professor of Public Policy and Business Responsibility. He's the director of the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation, a research center focusing on management and policy issues in communications, internet, and media. Niloofar Howe has been Chief Strategy Officer and Senior Vice President of RSA since late 2015. Ms. Howe leads the overall RSA corporate strategy, development, and planning activities. She has more than 25 years of experience and investing in the technology industry, with particular expertise in the security industry over the past decade. And William Drake is an international fellow and lecturer in the Institute of Mass Communication and Media Research at the University of Zurich, a member of the nominating committee of ICANN, a faculty member of the European and South Schools on Internet, an affiliate researcher at the Teleinformation Center of ELIS, and a key person working on these issues also in the World Economic Forum. So it's a wonderful group, and so without further delay, I'd like to get started. And I'd like to invite Bill to start off. This is going to be a conversation, not scripted, so we'll see where we go. But we'll start with Bill because he's written a marvelous background paper, something of analytical typography with Vinton Cerf, thinking about fragmentation. And it means different things to different people. So Bill, start us off. How do you think about fragmentation of the internet and cyberspace?
Thank you, Merritt, and hello, everybody. It's great to be back here at my alma mater after many years, and in fact, on a panel with one of the people who was on my dissertation committee historically. So it's great fun to be here. Well, fragmentation is, of course, a very timely and pressing issue, and it's one that's starting to manifest itself in the political environment in a lot of different ways. So I think it's good that we talk about it, particularly at the time where, as you say, we're also experiencing this rising economic nationalism and so on. The notion of internet fragmentation, I think, really is a contested one. It is not a sort of concept that everybody is in agreement on in a lot of important respects. If you look at the literature and the various public pronouncements that have been made by many different people, you find that the term gets used in a lot of different ways, often to suit the agendas of particular actors who have interests. So you find a lot of people in the private sector who will look at differences in national law that raise friction for their operations and say, oh, this is fragmentation, when in fact, very often those policies antedate the internet and really are a function of national traditions, and it's not necessarily put there in order to break the internet or something like that. You look at people who say, well, there's increasing linguistic diversity in the world, and this is fragmentation. To me, that just means that the world's getting online. So I don't think that's fragmentation. There are people who say fragmentation is something that only applies to the underlying infrastructure, that as long as the core resources of the internet continue to be interoperable and functional, et cetera, you don't really have fragmentation, and the only condition under which you would get fragmentation would be if you had some sort of cataclysmic breakdown to the network, which is not going to happen. There are a lot of different views about it. What I tried to do in the paper you referred to a year and a half ago was to try to step back and look at the sort of dynamics of what people were talking about and find what are the common denominators, and is there a core concern that one could speak to that recognizes the diversity of forms in which fragmentation expresses itself but still ties it to some basic elements. And my starting point was to say, if you think about the traditional way in which the internet was constructed by engineers who were interested in sharing information in a very open manner with each other, their notion was that any willing endpoint should be able to exchange information with any other willing endpoint. That you had an open agora, if you would, where resources could be shared and accessed and so on and so forth. If you start from that baseline, you start to recognize that fairly quickly, and especially after we began to move the internet out of being just a research and educational network and into being a global public facility that had economic and political and social implications, that all kinds of actors were going to want to impose conditions, restrictions, et cetera, upon it. And so you started to see fairly early on, I would argue, bits of fragmentation entering into the process where third parties would essentially insert themselves between two endpoints to say, you can access information under the following conditions, or you cannot access information at all. And this began to grow over time and was, I think, entirely predictable. And indeed, Ellie, in one of his papers, pointed this out and said that it was very much a natural phenomenon. So from my standpoint, fragmentation is simply a systemic property of the internet. It's an inevitability, and the question is, how well do we manage it? How do we respond to it? How do we track it? How do we begin to recognize when the level of fragmentation is moving from being something that's a small set of problems for a limited number of actors to being a broader, structural, permanent, divisive point that is blocking a lot of people's ability to use the net. And so from that standpoint, my feeling was we needed to have a more differentiated understanding of fragmentation, as including not just the technical layer, where a lot of things are still working perfectly fine, and where there's no cataclysm coming, but also the social layers, the layers in which people actually touch the internet, where people engage the internet and use the internet's resources to create value, to engage in relationships, to share information, to create, wealth, if you would. And there you see a lot of measures being adopted by firms and governments alike that in various ways impose limitations, impose levels of fragmentation onto the internet. And my view has been simply that we should look at the ones that are particularly problematic and ask ourselves, do we have a means for at least tracking this, knowing that this is going on, and making any kind of collective decision about how to deal with it, or do we just let it go? And that's been sort of the conversation I've been trying to start, and have been lucky to find that a lot of people share that interest. So that's been good.
Thank you very much. I think you spawned a very useful conversation that's occurring globally. I know Nilu has been thinking about this from many different perspectives.
So I wear a few different hats. My day job is as Chief Strategy Officer at RSA, the first independent cybersecurity company founded in 1982. Our job is actually often to prevent information to directly access in the name of security. I've been a venture investor for 20 some odd years focused on tech, and so that's a slightly different hat. And I've worked in the human rights field for over 30 years. And so if I wear my human rights hat, on the one hand, I have a very particular perspective about the importance of direct access online. And in fact, a lot of the organizations I'm involved with are about using the internet to empower minorities and disadvantaged people in society, to educate them, to create leadership. On the security side, on the other hand, I think the real question is a question of governance, right? We have this incredible medium. It started with a very utopian vision, slightly subversive in ways, right? Nationless, stateless, community-based, and it had limited reach in our lives. Today, every aspect of our lives is tethered to the internet, and it's only going to become increasingly tethered. So if we think about our personal lives, healthcare, banking, transportation, communication, education, we are becoming increasingly tethered to the internet. Privacy matters. If we think about businesses, we interviewed 4,000 CEOs over the past couple of years, and 85% of them will tell you that their top-line growth and profitability is tied to their ability to use mobile applications, to use the internet to drive growth and productivity. And of course, our government operations are increasingly coming online, whether it's at the national level or at the state and local level. So as we become more tethered to the internet, and by the way, every wave of technology innovation that we see coming at us, whether it's blockchain or drones or self-driving cars or augmented reality and virtual reality, all of those things are going to continue to make us more connected, more dependent on cyberspace. In the meantime, they also disintermediate our ability to provide security and privacy. And we have, as defenders, we have a structural disadvantage over folks who are attacking us online, which is we have to be right every single time to stop bad things from happening, whereas attackers only have to be right once to get in and cause massive disruption. And as long as human beings sit at the intersection of the internet, we are the weak link. We are how a lot of the adversaries get in. So as we think about governance, there's a lot of trends and issues that we have to turn into, and some real questions around what is the appropriate level of national sovereignty. One important fact, for example, from a security perspective, I think the estimate is $2.1 trillion in losses from data breaches. 75% of that is in the United States. So you have this fundamental agency problem as well, and geographic problem in the sense that certain geographies absorb the pain, and certain geographies benefit from, for example, criminal activity online. So there's a bit of a Wild West going on when it comes to cybersecurity and cybercrime, and how you create a governance model that doesn't undermine human rights, that doesn't undermine freedom, and allows us to protect our intellectual property, allows us to protect privacy, allows our governments to be able to do their business online, doesn't undermine our fundamental democratic process, is an interesting question to turn into. Time is not on our side on this one. And so it's something I think we have to figure out pretty aggressively.
Well, thank you very much.
Let me ask Ellie, moving to the intersection of the digital economy, how is it impacted by fragmentation, and are there forms of it that, in your view, we should or should not worry about?
Well, thank you. First, let me thank Dean Janow for being the spearhead on the Columbia campus. I mean, there are lots of internet activities going on, but she is the focus and the catalyst, and so we're all here because of her. Thank you. Now, this is a framing conversation panel here, and so the problem, I think, in the framing is already that we call it fragmentation, which is a loaded word. Splinternet, whatever the negative, balkanization. Suppose we call it pluralism. Suppose we call it diversity. Suppose we call it competition. That sounds much more positive, doesn't it? So because this discussion has been framed in these fragmentation terms, you can practically hear this deafening sound of collective hand-wringing going all around the world. And anybody, because partly the internet has moved into a belief system with its sacred texts and saints and scrolls and received wisdoms and history, and anybody who just varies from that golden past is kind of a heretic and is anti-freedom and anti-technology and anti-people and anti-everything. So, but clearly this is not a good system as it is, because it was in the past great and it got us to where we are, but now internet suffuses society, and therefore society suffuses also the internet. So I think in some ways this conservatism, this orthodoxy, the internet moving from audacity to orthodoxy is a really dangerous mindset, because it becomes conservative, protective of the established ways rather than forging, celebrating the future. I mean, the internet takes great pride in disrupting everything, and usually in a kind of positive sense. The music industry and so on, everything gets disrupted, except when it comes to the internet itself. You'd think that the internet would also kind of understand that disruption does not stop at the internet itself. And yet, when you touch that, you're kind of like a heretic, to which I would say, with greatest respect, internet, go disrupt yourself. So I used to think this was inevitable, that a system in which we now have some 50 wise men and possibly a woman, kind of corporate representatives making some technical decisions, strategic with their corporate interests, taking forever. And then now you have these governments playing around there in wherever capitals they are, and this becomes an issue of international global diplomats kind of being busybody-ish around the world, and resolutions and all kinds of UN bodies. I mean, this is a crazy system. It's just that we're used to it, like the frog in the water. And so I used to think that this would break itself up, and it will. However, and it does already. But now I actually think it's a good thing, not just an inevitable thing. It's a good thing because it provides the ability to establish different models. Now, the models, obviously, there will be some technical diversification happening. By the way, this is not just a national issue. This would be kind of industry coalitions, technology coalitions. This is a kind of super cross-country type arrangements that will interconnect, and the key thing for the future will be to establish arrangements, technical, legal, financial, economic, IP in both senses, in which enable this system to interoperate effectively rather than through that harmonization and that great effort which we are putting into in just kind of keeping it in some uniform, non-fragmented way. And I think when that happens, industry will actually, American industry in particular, will benefit from this, because when progress slows down and plateaus, that's where American industry loses out. We are kind of pretty good in when things are kind of going very rapidly, technology leader. When things are becoming plateaued, other countries, other industries catch up, lower cost possibly. So in some ways, kind of American industry is interested in the rapid development. American industry is also interested in not having these decisions being made by diplomats in political capitals. And so I think the private sector, once it recognizes that it has more of a chance, more of an opportunity, more innovation in a fragmented environment, will actually come to embrace it.
Thank you very much. I knew I could rely on you for giving a strong counter and conceptual views. But are there any features of the fragmentation from an economics perspective that worry you, Ellie?
Obviously, a harmonized, uniform, standardized system works, if it is ideal, works very well. There's absolutely no reason, however, to believe that it would be ideal. So a badly designed harmonized system is actually the worst of all worlds. Similarly, I think that a harmonized system makes it very difficult to move from point A to point B because so many players have to participate. So now your question, is there anything positive about it? Yeah, there's scale, and there are certain technical simplicities there, and people will have to kind of a bit work harder to make these things work with each other in the same way that we all have problems with our hi-fi, Wi-Fi, whatever systems at home, home networks, making things work together, and the same thing would happen on a national, international level. But I think we have very smart computer and technical people, and they will solve these problems. So I'm not worried.
Let me invite Bill and Nilu to jump in. I mean, do you agree with this view that there is an inevitability and that we should not turn this into, the orthodoxy of the maintenance of only one approach to thinking about the various layers of interruption that are occurring?
I think that the kind of view that Ellie is articulating is one that makes a lot of sense when you're talking about the traditional telecommunications industry, and I believe, in fact, Ellie, you were making that argument 30 years ago about the traditional telecom industry and the ways in which it had sort of metastasized into a sort of non-competitive, stifled ITU, International Telecommunication Union-based set of processes for managing flow of information and doing technical standards and so on. I don't see the internet as being the same sort of thing. The internet is an agglomeration of 60,000 plus autonomous systems that choose to interoperate by working through a shared set of protocols so that they can communicate effectively, even though their systems are managed differently and may be configured differently using different technologies and so on. So I don't think that there's this harmonized sort of approach that's been designed by faceless bureaucrats somewhere that is repressing innovation. I think that innovation is already very vibrant in the internet space, and that this is a sort of a category error in a way. The issue that I'm speaking to when I talk about fragmentation is simply one in which people who wish to be able to communicate and access resources are prevented from doing so. And if you think that the Chinese not being able to use Google or Facebook is an indicator of a dynamic that we should encourage, then okay, fine. But my view is that people should have the ability to be able to access information freely without having a third party come in and tell them no. Now, of course, when it comes to security, much of what you're talking about, this is a different matter altogether. If a community on the internet seeks to segment itself and put up protective barriers in order to mediate its relationship with the outside world, that's entirely reasonable, and I would not consider that as being fragmentation. It's a kind of segmentation, but I mean, at the end of the day, an actor or set of actors can choose to mediate how they want to connect to the outside world. What I don't like is when a third party comes in. When a government comes in and says, you can't see this. When intellectual property lawyers, and I know some in the room, insist on putting into search engines, this resource is not available to be seen in your jurisdiction. This kind of thing, it is actors taking it upon themselves to determine what other people can and cannot do with communications. And that, I think, is problematic, and that is growing. And yes, it is inevitable. As I said, there was no way, as the internet grew into a global public medium with billions of dollars of value associated with it, that wasn't going to happen. But the point is simply to be aware about the extent to which it happens and to think about whether there are cases that may not be in our collective interest that this kind of blocking is taking place, and then see whether some kind of dialogue or process can be constructed to ameliorate that. So, for example, one of the topics I'm working on now is a follow-up to the paper that you mentioned. Another study for the WEF is on this whole question of data localization and barriers to cross-border data flows. We're finding that a number of countries around the world are putting in place policies that require that data must be processed and retained and circulated within their territorial jurisdiction, rather than allowing it to move freely around the world in a way that the various applications that have been designed to manage data flow would like it to do. And similarly, they're putting in place barriers to data flow, where they're saying you cannot transfer this kind of data out of the country unless you meet these requirements or that kind of requirement. And again, this is something that governments are taking upon themselves to do, in some cases because they believe that it is, absolutely appropriate and consistent with their domestic values. So when it comes to the European privacy directives, for example, I understand fully that European institutions view privacy and the management of personally identifiable information in a particular way and don't want data to go to a place that doesn't have a similar level of protection. And that's an okay point. I think you can debate how that should be dealt with. But you find that a lot of other countries are doing this, using that same discourse, who do not in any way, shape, or form really care about privacy. Sorry to name names, but I mean, when China and Russia and Turkey and Indonesia and so on say you can't transfer data, it's not because they are working so hard to protect the privacy of their citizens. They're doing that as a sort of industrial policy and as a means of exercising greater control over their citizens. And that, I think, is problematic. So I would say, long story short, that I understand the basic instinct that Ellie has, that pluralism is a good thing, that we should not seek to have excessive harmonization that would in any way squelch innovation. But I don't think that the internet as it is constructed now actually does that so much. I don't have the feeling that being part of a single root zone file system and having multi-stakeholder global institutions to manage names and numbers and things like that is really such an impressive system that we must find ways to break free and have separate root zone file systems run by the Chinese or something like that. I don't see that as a problem. So we have just a little bit of a difference of view on exactly how that plays out.
Well, let's, fragmentation is a loaded term. I think a conference called Internet Segmentation may not have had the melodious ring to bring the diversity of views to it. But it happens by industry as well as by government in different forms of segmentation. And of course, now we've seen the rise of more platforms. And I think we're in the early stages of thinking about what these platforms mean. And I wonder, one could say that, there are benefits to platforms in terms of security, in terms of the kind of support services and others that you can create on platforms, the inclusion that can come from platforms. I wonder if Nilo would offer a view on whether this is a segmentation that is how you'd weigh the pluses and minuses.
So the conversation here between these amazing gentlemen just shows how complex the issue is, right? There has been tremendous growth because the internet has been an unregulated forum. I think it spawns so much innovation, and as we start thinking about regulation segmentation, GDPR is going to hamper ability for a lot of companies to do business in Europe. There's no question. It's going to hamper innovation because it's too scary a thought to actually run afoul of GDPR rules. Also, by the way, I think on the flip side of it, if the US decides it needs to protect .mil and .gov in a different way, no one's going to argue with that, hopefully necessarily. When it comes to platforms, I really believe that we live in an economy where the consumer is going to ultimately make the choice. And these platforms are trying to deliver a great user experience. And to do that, there's elements of it that need to be controlled, closed, however you want to frame it, to give that user experience. Now, if it starts becoming too repressive, if it starts becoming too closed, the consumer will simply choose to go elsewhere, and there won't be much stopping them. And over time, it will be easier and easier to port your data, port your email, port your photos, whatever it is, to a completely different platform. So I'm actually not that worried about the circle becoming a real thing. I don't know if anyone read the book or I don't even know if the movie's out yet. But I'm not worried that there's going to be a platform that is going to simply take over the world and essentially choke off innovation. As we look at these platforms emerging, we're still spending $70 billion-ish a year on innovation in the venture capital industry. We're funding 8,000 new companies every year. We will figure out how to innovate using these platforms, how to innovate around these platforms. And like I said, the moment the consumer decides, this isn't good for me, they will move to a different platform. When it comes to the choices these platforms make, and you talked about third parties imposing restrictions, the issue is that sometimes there's real economic trade-offs. When Akamai decided to choke Tor off, it was because of the amount of bandwidth that was being used, and it was a real economic issue for Akamai. So there are legitimate reasons why third parties may actually contribute to segmentation, fragmentation, to denying access to content because they have to bear the cost of it. So again, it's a nuanced, it's a complex debate. There's a balance that has to be reached between unregulated innovation and the ability to provide great experience, to protect your citizens, to have access. But I'm actually not worried about the platforms that are emerging and whether they're going to either cause, reduce innovation or cause additional fragmentation.
I invite you to join this.
I actually think these platforms are the solution to a lot of these issues because they will, just because the consumers will choose and companies will choose to the extent that there are more restrictions and more restrictions on the public internet, they will find ways around it, and that will be very hard to choke off. I mean, Bill is talking about a certain kind of internet libertarianism of imposing the state between two endpoints. And so wouldn't it be great if everything would be free without government intervention? That sounds good. Problem with this libertarianism, the John Perry Barlow government, we have not called you, leave us alone, is that it's really just a bunch of words at this point because the internet organizations themselves are calling government in all the time. I mean, whatever you think about net neutrality, it's not libertarian in any way. And so I think kind of what will happen then is that these various platforms, global, will kind of do their own thing, route their own traffic over their own arrangements that they kind of do in combination with other people. And inevitably, they will be competing with each other, and inevitably, they will adopt different technological solutions in a variety of ways, and so we will see centrifugalism happening. And it's kind of that, therefore, these negotiations, technical negotiations among clouds, are going to be at the center of in the future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So let's just say one more word about if you have any shared views around the innovation consequences of walled gardens, let's call them. There are benefits to this, some of them, security, et cetera. I think Ellie is suggesting that there'll be no hampering of innovation necessarily that will result from this. Let's take a country like China. I mean, tremendous innovation occurring within China in the internet space. Any comments about the negativity? Do you have to be a certain scale to have that occur?
First of all, I have to say that this is the first time in 40 years anybody's ever called me a libertarian, so I thank you very much for that. That's an interesting spin. That I'm anything but. Look, the platforms are increasingly central to the world economy. and they perform a lot of very useful functions in many cases. The number of small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and entrepreneurs who are able to get onto Facebook, get onto Google, get onto whatever, and carve out a space and become engaged in global economic activity is extraordinary, and that is a huge boon to economic development and so on. There's no question about that. And there's no question that, Apple and others provide their customers with a level of security that is guaranteed within their walled garden. At the same time, it also has to be said it's not so easy to port your information out from one place to another. Switching costs are not that low. Try to take all your stuff that you've put onto Facebook over the past 20 years and say, Facebook, I want to move this to another platform. Doesn't work. And the fact of the matter is, as more and more activity devolves into those spaces, it devolves from somewhere else that it was taking place before. And, you end up in a world, I won't use a term like Facebookistan, but you end up in a world where, the terms of service of these various platforms are effectively functioning like sovereign states, telling you exactly how you may speak, use your resources, so on and so forth. So that is a little bit of a downside, I think. And there are questions about, as these things continue to become the black holes into which advertising dollars and e-commerce activity all gravitates, what that means for everybody who had another business model that was on the outside and so on. You've got people being wiped out all the time because they can't compete with the Amazons, the Facebooks, the so ons. So one could argue that this may, while there is definitely growth, and there's the creation of whole new industries like apps, et cetera, that are very useful, that at the same time, some forms of inequalities may be strengthened in this process. And moreover, one thing I'm particularly concerned with, as one of those people who lives in Geneva and hangs around with those boring European bureaucrats who spend their time wringing their hands over things like this, I worry about the developing countries. I talk to many people from developing countries who say, we can't get access to work on those platforms because we don't have the same credit requirements, we're not able to use the same payment systems, we're not, lots of different factors. So all I would suggest is, what would be useful? The answer is not, let's regulate the platforms. The answer is that the platforms should be encouraged by their communities to engage in more socially constructive thinking and planning about how they can contribute to broader development, and I think some are trying to do that.
So I think I would bet on innovation every time, right? So Facebook, yes, not easy to port. So Instagram pops up. And different mediums and different forms of communication, and each generation has a different way that, things that it rejects, like Facebook. And my teenage children often tell me that my modes of communication are completely outdated. They can't believe I'm still on Facebook. But you move to Instagram, you move to Snapchat, and as these platforms that don't give the experience that the users want become too restrictive, I do think there's opportunity in the internet, in the digital economy, to actually disrupt, and to disrupt incredibly fast. It is so inexpensive these days to build disruptive applications that can displace a lot of these established vendors. It's harder to displace Google, for sure. But also, if you take Apple, the ecosystem of innovation that exists around Apple is tremendous. The experience that Apple gives its users is amazing across the board. And that's a choice you make if you want to play in that ecosystem. So I would bet on innovation. I would bet on entrepreneurship. I think even geographically, you're seeing specific applications being developed in entrepreneurship happening in developing countries, in Africa, in China, in Eastern Europe, platforms that are very specific to the particular social norms and social practices of those areas. They don't have to come on Facebook. They have their own. So I'm less worried about the constraints that these platforms impose today, just because of how easy it is to, it's not simple, but it is disruptible if it becomes too constraining and doesn't meet the user's needs and requirements.
And you are not French.
So let's take.
That is correct. I am not French.
So in France, I hear about GAFA all the time.
Okay, a quick comment, then I want to move to one more topic before we open it up.
Yeah, I think that in some ways the platforms in rivalrous and their challenge is possible, but let's be realistic here. Nobody has shown up lately to compete effectively with Google. All right, and these are kind of large market shares, and they are kind of huge market shares internationally, globally, not just in one country, and so there's a handful of companies. I've written about this in a recent book on who owns the world's media, so there's lots of numbers and statistics there. And so it becomes, while it used to be easier to compete against and to start up, it's not so easy, and the economies of scale and the network effects and for all kinds of reasons. I think one of the public policy issues should be to make it easier to enter and to compete, and that includes also making it easier for consumers to switch. Just as with mobile phones, you had number portability, which makes it easier to switch between one company to another. It should be easier for a consumer to move from Facebook to a rival alternative without having to forego and invest a lot of effort and time in doing so. So those are things that we should think in forward to make it a more competitive system.
Well, we're going to switch soon into a geopolitical and institutional discussion, but before leaving this conversation, let me ask you each if you have a view as to the governance oversight, if you will, that is needed with respect to the digital economy. We'll talk later about trade, and of course trade rules barely create some very important building blocks, but barely cover at the international level digital trade, for example. We have national regulations, secrecy, privacy, security, et cetera. Early stage development around norms. As you think about the digital economy, as well as the internet more fundamentally, any comments on the governance systems? Nilo, would you like to start us?
Sure. Figuring how you govern information and use of the internet is incredibly tough. I mean, there's multi-stakeholder organizations that try to do it, but it's overwhelmed. The international bodies, I think, are overwhelmed with what is actually happening online. I think fundamentally we don't even have domestic policy that's adequate relative to this. Even in the most basic framing, from a security perspective, we don't have defined engagement policy, escalation policy, retaliation policy. If you look at what happened with our elections, it's a perfect example of how lack of policy, how little policy we really have, and know exactly how to govern even the most existential and the most clearly sort of national security driven issues. I worry that, I'm a free market person. I do think that over time it all balances out, and if you overregulate, you will actually hamper innovation. There are some very important areas that we have to think about, and if I wear my security hat, if you think about the Internet of Things, for example, having basic regulation, basic policy that drives how those devices are built with security in mind becomes incredibly important. But the big governance issue right now that I think everyone's grappling with, and even internet fragmentation touches on, is, as we've all sort of touched on, so nuanced, so complicated. And it's complicated by the fact that we actually do not have it is this ubiquitous form of communication that crosses every national border, and yet we do not have social norms that are consistent from one country to the next. And so how you create a governance model that applies across the board when the social norms aren't agreed to is very hard. How you do that in a non-stateless way becomes incredibly difficult.
Let me invite 1 minute each for you.
Yeah, so on the response here, governance. The internet and ICT industry more general in technology has been moving at Moore's law, exponential rate, and but government, of course, has not. If anything, it has become slower than before. Why? Because the internet partly has made it possible to organize constituencies, to agitate, to block, so everything has become more complicated. I mean, whatever you think of a smoke-filled back room, it was a relatively quick decision-making process, and the more open and transparent you are, the slower the process is. So there's a trade-off, and this trade-off we are in the middle of. So I would say here, the kind of a governance system is going to be slow. It's also going to be dominated probably by the losers, and there are always more losers than winners in these situations. And so it's not going to be a good result. Ideally, and wonderful worldwide, global, liberal type arrangements, the reality is going to be very different. And so we have to accept the fact that the world is messy, and the internet is going to be messy, and the best thing we can hope for is a certain partial solutions to partial problems in partial regions of the world. And they're going to be somewhat in tension with each other, but that's life.
Bill?
I'm partial to his partiality. I would say, that governance, the search for like some uniform kind of solution to all the problems of governance is just simply impossible. As we meet right now, there are a group of negotiators gathered in a dark, dusty room in Building E of the United Nations in Geneva talking about enhanced cooperation, where a number of developing country governments continue to lobby for the creation of some sort of uber body within the United Nations that would have responsibility for all these kinds of things. And this cannot work. We have a highly distributed topography of governance institutions. Some are multilateral, some are multi-stakeholders. Some work effectively, some work less effectively. We have in that mix a quite interesting experience with ICANN having become an independent process, one that is no longer moored to the authority of the United States government and is now accountable to the global community through those who participate in its processes. It's a very interesting model to be looked at. I think that there will be a lot of efforts to devise other kinds of approaches in the future that are more innovative, more flexible, more dynamic than the traditional architecture of institutions that we've had in place. And people are struggling to think about exactly how that would work. But obviously what is not going to happen is that all these things will in some manner congeal into some mega thing. It will remain distributed, and it will remain a process of stop and go, successes, failures, decentralized. What I would hope for is greater information sharing, greater ability across the board for people to get access to the information about where issues are being dealt with. Because what I get all the time, and I will stop, what I get all the time in Geneva is developing country governments who will come to me and say, well, look, there's no place in the UN system or anywhere else where I can go to deal with problem X. Where do I go? And the best we can do is to say, here is a set of information resources and people who can help you develop relationships with the people who are on the ground working on those issues to devise a solution that's appropriate to you. And my hope would be that over time we would grow something that would help countries deal with problems through better navigation of the existing topography of institutions and processes that there are out there today.
Thank you. I think we have just a few minutes for comments, questions. Could I collect two, please, and then let some final remarks? Yep.
Josh Corman from Atlantic Council. The biology tells us nature loves diversity and monocultures are bad, and you have a common mode failure. So that would argue for not fragmentation, but healthy segmentation and isolation. I understand the original version of the internet. My question is really around, there's been some recent disruptions like Mirai, very large-scale botnets that Akamai can't stop. It was 20% of 20% of its full attack power. A failure to regulate could stifle innovation and hurt the economy. If we look at the internet as a global marketplace, a market-enabling market, the question becomes, question becomes, a choice not to regulate is in fact a regulatory choice. So what are the harder truths we need to bring into this debate beyond what we prefer, but also what might allow continued trade and continued market innovation? Because we're at the cusp of seeing a failure to regulate stifle innovation.
Your security prison.
Well, I think if you look at what happened in 2016, it actually projects a terrifying future. If you look at the Mirai botnet, which was basically just a wink, wink, here's what we could do if we wanted to, right? Your toaster became a threat vector to take down Twitter. You look at the DNC hack, right? A country with the economy of Italy and every demographic trend working against it, causing the United States to fundamentally lose faith in its most fundamental democratic process. You look at the Yahoo breach, which was a billion accounts hacked. There's only 3.5 billion internet users. 60% of them use the same username password on their email as they do on their financial applications. You put all of those things together, and the future is starting to look a little bit scary, and that's why I call it the rise of what we call the hacker industrial complex. Less than 1% prosecution of cybercrime, complete lack of enforcement globally, and where the threats start, where the crime originates from, and the target are completely different countries. US and UK absorb most of that crime, and the crime it originates around the world. And they're using, by the way, Facebook and Twitter to launch those crimes. They're no longer hiding. The dark web is unnecessary for cyber criminals because there is no prosecution. You can figure out who they are. Attribution is not a problem. Prosecution is. So if we don't turn into this problem, fragmentation is a theoretical issue at best, because it will become existential to our ability to, and we'll get into this, right? Trust, assurance, privacy, and even existential to some extent. I mean, Dallas's 911 system was overwhelmed 2 weeks ago, again, as a joke. Like, imagine if those people really wanted to take down emergency response systems. It's not that hard. So there's a lot we're going to have to turn into, and Eli was absolutely right. I mean, tech is moving at such a fast pace, social norms are lagging behind it, and policy and regulation are so far behind those two vectors that we have to turn into it fast.
Thank you. One more question, comment? Yes. You could, if you use the mic, others could hear you.
Hi, my name is Melody Chain. I really thank for the sharing. My question is, if you can use one sentence to summarize your stance on governance, what would you like to advocate for? Thank you.
Bill?
To me?
To all of us.
To all of us. I have been a longstanding champion of greater multi-stakeholder engagement at the global level, making sure that policy processes are not captured by the most powerful, but that all are able to work side by side in the search for solutions to problems that we all confront.
I am concerned that the multi-stakeholder environment can't act fast enough to actually provide the governance that we need. So set the incentives right, deal with the agency issue, make sure the folks who are responsible for the technology bear the cost of it if it's misused, and let industry tackle most of those problems. The government has to address the policy issue, but a lot of the regulation has to be self-regulation coming from industry for it to move fast enough to be effective.
And mine would be two mottos. One is let 1,000 flowers bloom, and the second one is e pluribus unum. Unfortunately, that one is already taken.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to have just a quick break before our next session, but please join me in thanking this fantastic panel for opening us up. Yeah.